Hi, I'm Daniel Burke, and today I'm going to teach you everything you need to make an amazing, authentic Texas-style brisket, even if it's your first time. So let's talk brisket. Today I'm going to cover everything you need. What materials you need, how to shop for a brisket, how to pick the best one, how to trim and prepare one, how to make your own spice rub, what type of wood to use, how to cook it, and how to slice it. Brisket isn't as simple as throwing on a grill and cooking it like a steak. With a little time and effort and some patience, anybody can cook an amazing, authentic Texas-style brisket. Now, everything we talk about, we will have links below that go into great detail about all the topics, whether it's picking brisket, what components to use, how to manage fire, how to smoke your brisket, what kind of butcher paper we use, all of those things. Okay, let's start with the materials I use. You don't have to buy all of this stuff, but this is just a rundown of all the things that I use. And really, even though we're gonna go through this list, the most important things that you wanna pay attention to are the boning knife for trimming and the slicing knife for cutting. And really, it's the boning knife is the most important one. Boning knife, don't buy the most expensive one. You just want something that's sharp. You can get them at Walmart. I think mine was like 10 or 15 bucks on Amazon. But you want a boning knife. You might want to invest in a sharpener too to keep it sharp. But a boning knife, you'll need that to trim the fat. Rubber gloves, I use rubber gloves. I just like to protect against infection. I tend to be careful around raw meat products, so I wear gloves when I'm trimming and preparing any kind of handling of raw meat. They also come in handy when you're trimming things like hot peppers, if you're making a stew or chili, or some Texas Twinkies with some of that leftover brisket. So rubber gloves, I'll invest in these. You're gonna want a sharp knife for slicing. You might have one from Thanksgiving turkey, and that should be okay. I've got a few different ones. The first time I sliced a brisket, I used my bread knife. I've got this old hickory here. It's a little bit longer. That's my rib knife for cutting along the bones and picking it off of the grill. But for a slicer, I have a longer slicer. This is especially good for trimming larger cuts of brisket. So invest in a slicer. You can get a good one for 20, 30, 40 bucks. Don't break the bank. So knife sharpener, this is good. This will keep your knife sharp. You can use this a few ways. There's all sorts of tutorials. They're all different, but they're not hard to use. You want to invest in one of these when you get a chance. Now charcoal, we'll talk about this more, but you're gonna want some charcoal to lay down as the base of your fire, and I prefer lump charcoal to briquettes because there's less ash and it holds the temperature a little bit better. Now wood logs or chunks, it's gonna depend on the size of your smoker. For Texas style brisket, you're gonna want post oak wood for Texas style brisket, but there's a variety of wood you can use, but you're gonna need to invest in some wood, and you can get it at sporting goods stores, you can get it at supermarkets, you can have a private supplier, grilling supplies. Now when it comes to thermometers, I've got one that's built in on all my smokers. I also have waterproof Bluetooth with 4 probes, 2 for the temperature inside that I use and 2 for each side of the meat. I put 1 probe into the point and 1 into the flat just to monitor the temperature. They're not necessary, but they come in handy. Wi-Fi thermometers are much more expensive, and you generally don't need those because you're not going to be leaving the house with this type of smoker. So Bluetooth should be fine. They have a pretty good range. I've also got a handheld instant read. I've got a $10 job from Walmart. This thing is great. This is especially good when you're checking the temperature to make sure it's ready to pull from the heat. Butcher paper and aluminum foil. We'll talk about wrapping, but if you're gonna do foil, you want heavy duty aluminum foil, none of that weak stuff. And then butcher paper, not the white wax kind. You want unwaxed paper. They call it peach paper. They call it pink paper. They might call it brown paper. Below in the video, there will be a link to this where you can look up the type of paper that we use. Butcher paper, excellent for wrapping brisket. You'll want to get some kosher salt. You'll also want to invest in some coarse ground pepper, black pepper. You may add a little bit of garlic powder, not necessary. Some people will add onion powder and chili powder as well, but salt and pepper are the 2. A good spray bottle for spritzing. You can use water. I tend to use apple cider vinegar and apple juice mixed together, but the spray bottle is key. Okay, let's talk about choosing a brisket. We're gonna cover the grade of meat, overall marbling and shape. and then the thickness of the flat. Those are the three things that matter to me. Now, brisket is a relatively inexpensive cut of meat. It's used to make things like pastrami, corned beef, and of course, authentic Texas-style brisket. How to shop for one. Just about every supermarket carries an untrimmed Packer-style brisket. What you'll see in a brisket, when I say both muscles, it's a full brisket. You've got a full fat cap on top, you got a big piece of deckle fat on the side, and two muscles. Underneath, we're gonna call this the bottom, that's the flat. That's where your lean brisket comes from. And then that big, fatty, thick part on top, that's the point. That's gonna be your moist stuff right there. That's the good stuff. A lot of folks like the point, not because it's fatty, because it's more moist and you get a lot of flavor. The USDA has 8 grades of beef, but only a few are for human consumption, and the ones that you're gonna see in the store are gonna be prime, which is the highest, choice, which is probably the most common, and then also select. You may also see certified Angus beef, and that is essentially a high-end choice. Now, you'll see things advertised as Wagyu or American Wagyu. That's just a high-end prime. It's good. It generally costs double what a normal prime does, but if you can find a good deal on it, grab it. It's great stuff. Now, the biggest, most identifiable difference in all these cuts of meat is going to be in the marbling. And when I say marbling, I mean the little specks and streaks of fat that you see intertwined throughout the muscles. That's good. You want that. You want a bunch of little white spots of fat in that beef. The more the better, because that's going to render out, it's going to keep it moist and juicy and delicious. That's why you're paying more for prime. I'll try to find a brisket with a thicker flat towards the end, so I have to trim less off. More bang for your buck. A lot of folks will swear by the bend test, meaning you can fold the brisket in half easily to determine how good the quality is of that. That is not as important to me as the thickness of the flat. Another thing I look for besides the marbling, I will also look to see what the overall weight is. I tend to target about 12 to 14 pounds just because that means it's not going to take me as long to cook the brisket. Right now we've got a meat shortage going on, and I found this fantastic certified Angus beef on sale, but it's 19.5 pounds. It's going to be a longer cook because it's good quality. I don't need to cut much off, but you just want to know for every pound that you get, you're looking at about an hour of cooking. Here's another note on shopping for a brisket and meal planning. Your serving weight for a brisket is about 50% of what your pre-cook was, between the trimming of the fat and then the moisture that comes out when you're cooking. So for instance, a 16-pound brisket will yield you about 8 pounds of cooked brisket. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. It's not exact science, but that generally is how it works out. So 50%, just remember that. Whatever you're buying in the store, you'll have about half of that when it's all said and done post-cook. Let's talk about trimming this thing. This is the part that I think is the most intimidating for people. It is not as complicated as it sounds. It's not as hard as it sounds. You just have to know what you're doing, and that doesn't take much. And here's a pro tip. Don't pull your brisket out until right before you're ready to cut it. You want to cut your brisket and trim it when it's fresh out of the refrigerator so it's as cold as possible. You want that fat to be firm, to be pretty cold and hard so that it's easy to cut off. You don't want it jiggling all around while you're cutting it. Now when you open the packaging, just be careful. You don't want to splash blood. You can tell when you open it, some have a whole bunch of blood in there, some don't have very much at all. Just take a look at it. Just be careful when you're opening that. I open it from the top first. I'll tend to pat it down. You don't need to rinse it. Some people will rinse theirs in the sink, but now you're spreading pathogens all over the place and you got to do extra cleanup. It's not necessary. So just what I'll do is I'll cut apart some paper towels and I'll just pat it down and throw those in the trash. I'll keep a trash can handy because the fat goes straight in there as I'm trimming. Now I've already said it's not that complicated to cut. There are 4 steps to trimming a brisket. The first one is just trimming around the sides. I will trim all around the sides, just real thin. It can even be like a 1/4 inch just along the sides. This will expose exactly how thick that fat cap is. It can trim off some of the harder texture meat that's been exposed a little bit. It's gonna make your brisket more aerodynamic. We're using an offset smoker today, so that means the smoke is gonna travel from one end of the smoker to the other, and we want this smoke to travel smoothly. Anything that's protruding or sticking out has a tendency to get burned. So we're gonna trim all the way around to keep it smooth, but it'll also show us the thickness all around the brisket where we need to trim. That's step one. When I cook with an offset smoker, I cook it with the fat cap up. So we're gonna trim this entire fat cap down to about a 1/4 inch thick. Don't worry about measuring this. You don't have to be exact. Just try to get it down to about a 1/4 inch. That's the perfect amount of fat. That's gonna render down beautifully into almost nothing. All that moisture is gonna go into the meat You don't want too much because then you just get a mouthful of fat on every bite, but 1/4 inch is great. You want to cut this down. This is really where having a very cold brisket is going to pay off. Now and then you're going to cut too deep and make a divot where you can see the meat. Don't panic about that, okay? That's not going to hurt it at all. It's not going to dry out your meat. The biggest problem you're going to have there is some of the moisture might pool in there. Some pit masters will put a wood chunk underneath the brisket, elevating it in the center so that moisture will roll off a little better, and that can help if you have a lot of divots. Okay, step 3, I'll flip the brisket over and I'm going to remove this big chunk of decal fat, this harder, thick piece of fat. That's useless. You can't use that for sausage. That's not going to render down. Just get rid of it. Cut it down. Don't try to chisel in between the two muscles and get it there, because you're going to cause those protruding pieces of meat to burn or dry out. But just cut that piece off and trim it down as best as you can. And finally, step 4, if you look here, this is called silver skin. It's like a fatty membrane on the bottom. Cut the most obnoxious looking ones, the biggest offenders, as you're cutting the silver skin. Don't worry about being exact here, but you want to cut some of this off, especially the more obvious pieces that are there. Just cut that off and you'll be ready to put a rub on. The official Texas style brisket rub, here's the secret recipe. It's 50% kosher salt and 50% coarse ground pepper. That's it. That's a Texas style rub. Don't be skeptical of the simplicity. This is exactly what you want. Now you can trick it up as well. You can do a couple ounces of salt, a couple ounces of pepper, and maybe a tablespoon or so of garlic powder. I would keep it at that. I know some folks who will also add onion powder and a little chili powder. You can buy a lot of rubs. Really, it's up to you. You use what rub you want, but I would say if this is your first time, do this Texas style, official Texas rub, salt and pepper. So when putting the rub on, if you're doing this Texas style, just apply it moderately. You want to cover all around the brisket, but don't coat it so thick you can barely see the meat. I know there's different types of rubs out there, and there's a lot of good ways to do this, but if you want Texas style, moderately cover the brisket and the salt and pepper rub. And yes, as a tip, do the bottom flat side first, so when you flip it over, you put it on the fat side second, and you can put it right on the smoker. It's okay to pat it on the sides all the way around. So remember, we want flavor. We're going for what's called bark, okay? So a good combination of a moderate rub, some smoke from your post oak logs, and some of the moisture of the meat is going to create a coating all around. It's going to be black. It'll be soft to the touch. That's exactly what you want. That's not burned. That's perfect. Okay, fire management. Look, every smoker is different. The shape, the size, the thickness of the steel, everything. We're only going to say a little bit about this because each smoker is totally unique, but there's a couple universal tips that we can give you about how to manage a fire and why that's important. I start my fire using a chimney full of lump charcoal as a base. And then on top of that, I'll put the first log. I do about one at a time. You can use wood chunks as well, but that can get more expensive, that's all. When buying wood, you want to make sure that the wood size you're getting to fits inside your firebox. That's important. I prefer lump charcoal to briquettes, not just because I think it holds the temperature better and longer, but mainly because of the ash. There's much less ash with lump charcoal than there is with briquettes. You can totally have a good fire if you use briquettes. Don't panic. Now, when lighting the charcoal, this is important. Do not use lighter fluid. You don't want that taste in your brisket. There's a couple different ways. Paraffin wax cubes that you can buy. Those are fine. You won't have a taste to those. Or these tumbleweed style fire starters. You can put those under the chimney. You can go old school and crackle up some newspaper, but I would not use lighter fluid. That's not going to taste good. Don't do that. Now, the goal here is clean fire. A clean fire versus a dirty fire. And here's what that means. Thick, white billowing smoke, that's a dirty fire. You don't want that. That's not going to taste good. That's going to just build up like creosote, like the inside of a chimney. You don't want to eat that. Clean smoke, they call it blue smoke, clear smoke. That's what you want. That's ideal. That's a clean fire. One of the best ways to do that, after you put each log inside the firebox, put the next one on deck, kind of like a batter circle, just put it on the firebox. It'll heat it up. The heated piece tends to burn faster, tends to flame up faster, and therefore it smolders less and smokes less. Now again, when choosing logs, post oak is the best. You can buy it at a lot of sporting goods stores, or some supermarkets will have it. You may have a grilling store where you can get it. Post oak is the key to Texas brisket. But if you're in an area where it's not available, use any kind of oak, white oak or red oak. Some kind of an oak is good. If you can't get oak, pecan or pecan, depending on what part of the country you live in. That's a nice tasting wood. You can even use hickory. The mild sweet fruit woods like applewood, cherry, and things of that nature, any kind of a tree that has a fruit, that's a good wood. Those fruit woods are going to be a little more mild, so oak is the best, but don't panic if you can't get it. There are other ways to do this. But man, try to get that post oak if you can. Don't use mesquite. That's better for grilling. That's too strong for a long cook like this. Just don't do it. Never use any kind of pine. Don't use normal firewood. The type of wood you have matters. Trust me. The last thing I'll say on fire management is your temperature. You want to try and maintain a temperature right around between 225 to 250. In a smaller smoker, especially if it's windy, that temperature is going to flare up with the wind. It's going to go up and down because of the thickness of the metal. So just try and keep it in that range. If you look down and all of a sudden it's at 300, don't freak out. Close the firebox a little so there's a little less oxygen. I tend to leave the chimney all the way open at all times. If it gets too low, if it looks like it's going out, I mean, you look away for 15 minutes, suddenly there's no fire, or you fell asleep and you woke up and it's 180 degrees in there, don't panic, just start it up. When it comes to fire management, no matter how careful you are, no matter how well of a job you do, no matter how on top of you are, you're gonna get some dirty smoke. It's gonna happen at some point. Don't panic, just do the best to mitigate that. Beef is resilient, okay? Just get that fire back up to where you want it and roll that smoke. Now, on an offset smoker, I know there's a lot of opinions, but this is the correct one, okay? On an offset smoker, put the meat in fatty side up, and you wanna point the fattier part of the brisket, the point towards the heat source, okay? Just like this. That's going to absorb more of the heat. This is exactly how you want to do it. Now, fat side down, if you're using a pellet smoker or maybe a Weber Smokery Mountain where the heat source is directly beneath, then I would do the fat side down. But for this, fat side up, this is the way to do it. Okay, so Texas style brisket, low and slow. You want to keep that temperature in a range 225 to 250. Get some kind of a remote thermometer, whether it's a Bluetooth one like the one I have. Costs just a little more extra to get the waterproof one. That's priceless, especially if you leave your sprinkler on one night. For sources. The Wi-Fi models tend to be expensive. That's better if you have a pellet grill because you can actually control the grill then with Wi-Fi. Like you could turn it on and maintain the temperature if you were out at the store or at the office or something like that, or just lazy and up in your bedroom. You can't do that on an offset, so I don't think the Wi-Fi is necessary for this sort of cook, but a Bluetooth thermometer, that's helpful, man, especially if you want to go in the house and you don't want to just stare at it. So Bluetooth thermometer, I have an Inkbird waterproof model. There's a lot of different models. Just look up the reviews and pick one that suits your budget. I think you're looking 40, 60 bucks, something like that for this. You can get 4 probe models, you can get 6 probe models, and invest in a waterproof one. I have an inexpensive instant thermometer too. This is a Walmart special. This is 10 bucks. This thing works beautifully. I use this at the end for a couple reasons. On a brisket, just to make sure it hits the right temperature. The internal temperature right around 203 on both the flat and the point. You want that. That means it's ready to rest and it's gonna slice beautifully. Hey, a quick word on spritzing. Invest in a inexpensive spray bottle. I tend to spritz it about once every hour or so, maybe a little bit more often than that. You don't want to be opening your smoker more often than that, really. But I'll spritz it about every hour or so. It just keeps the meat from drying out and moist. To me, the ideal spritz for a brisket is about 50% apple cider vinegar and 50% apple juice. If you can't find those, or if you forgot to do those or whatever, and you've just got water, you can spritz with water. I find the cider and the apple juice combo doesn't mess with the flavor, and it tends to stay on more than just the evaporating water. It tends to permeate that meat and keep it moist without ruining the flavor. Let's talk about the stall. This is the part that confounds everybody. If you can make it past this part, you're well on your way to being an expert. The stall is what we call the period of time when you're cooking the meat where as the temperature has been slowly going up and the meat is suddenly stalls. It may even go down a little bit. Don't panic. Some people will increase the heat. Some people will wonder what's gone wrong. They think the thermometer is broken. No, this is totally normal. This is science. It's called convective cooling. That's what the stall is. Keep going, just stick with the plan. After a few hours, your temperature will start going back up again. It's called the stall. It happens every time. After a few hours, your temp will start going back up, and you're well on your way to the finish line. Some people will refer to wrapping a brisket by its other name, the Texas cheat. Okay, when to wrap. Some people will wrap their brisket at a certain period of time, or when they think they're in the stall, or when it hits a certain temperature, and there are all kinds of people who make the case for doing it a certain way. I'm not one of them. That makes no sense to me, and I'll tell you why. The whole point of wrapping your brisket, on the one hand, to accelerate some of the cooking process, to maybe shave a little bit of time off to give your brisket less chance to dry out. But you don't want to wrap your brisket before you have the bark that you want, before the surface looks as good as what you want. So once it's got the right bark, you can kind of touch it with your finger and it doesn't scratch off. You can feel it. It's not hard, but it's nice and soft, but it's been set on that brisket. Now you're well on your way. Now what does it mean to wrap a brisket? We use butcher paper. We'll just wrap it in a thin layer. This helps keep the moisture in, but it's also breathable, and that's better. Now some people won't wrap it all. They'll just leave that brisket on there, let it cook till it's done. I tend to think that that's gonna get a little bit too much smoke, especially on an inexpensive smoker like this. You're gonna have that fluctuating temperature. You don't wanna just leave it out there for 12, 14 hours. You don't wanna do that. Some people will use aluminum foil to wrap, and that's good. That'll hold a lot of moisture in. The problem with that is that when you use aluminum foil, there's really no breathing that goes. All the moisture is kept in there, and you end up with a smoky pot roast. There's worse things you can have than a smoky pot roast, by the way. But it's gonna fall apart when you slice. It's just not gonna be perfect. I'll have some links below where you can find this stuff, but this is what we use. We just flip it over a couple of times when we wrap it here. As you can see, you don't want it wrapped in several layers, just a layer or two of paper. You fold that up and put it right back on the smoker. Now some people, once they've wrapped, will actually throw it in the oven. This tends to be something if someone's they can't stay awake, it's late at night, or if it's like a thunderstorm outside, you're gonna finish that thing any way you can. I would say the best way to do it is to continue to leave it on the smoker because it's gonna still pick up a little bit of smoke, but this is where some folks will finish in an oven. So regardless of size, generally you start getting the type of bark you want at about the 6 hour mark, maybe 7, somewhere between 6 to 7 hours. That's where I'll tend to wrap, and that's something that's true regardless of the size of the brisket because it's been getting smoke all the way through. Now the quality of the smoke, whether it's a clean or a dirty fire, that can impact that a little bit, but it's about 6 or 7 hours. Again, for a smaller smoker like one of these, like you're gonna have in your backyard, it gets windy. And that causes the temperature to flare up. And that can make your fire get hotter, it can make it get real smoky. So you don't wanna leave that on there for 12 to 14 hours. That's why I wrap. It's not so much about speeding the process, but it's more about getting the bark I want and then keeping it protected exactly the way I want it. Okay, the big question is, when do we stop cooking this thing? How long are we going? The simple answer is this: when you get to an internal temperature of about 203 degrees. At that point, you can pull that sucker off, let it rest for at least an hour. Do not cut that thing as soon as you pull it up. Let it sit for at least an hour. We will ban you from Texas if you cut it immediately. So when it hits 203 degrees on both the flat and the point, that's when I'll pull it. I'll keep it wrapped. You can put it in an old cooler and wrap it with some towels. You can stick it in your oven in like an aluminum tray. Don't turn the oven on, but just somewhere where you can keep it there and let it rest for an hour. You can leave it on the counter. You can leave it in a cooler. You can put it in an unheated oven, but let it sit for at least an hour, up to maybe 4 hours if it's sitting like that. If you need it to sit longer than that, then you might want to have an oven on a very low setting, but you don't want to keep cooking it. Now, if you're wrapping it with towels, here's a pro tip, guys. Don't use the good towels. Your wife is going to kill you. Per sources. I've just heard of this happening before. All right, we're getting to the fun part, how to slice. Now some, and even some restaurants, will separate at this point, the flat and the point, by cutting through that fat layer in the middle and creating two separate pieces of cooked meat at this point. I don't do that. What I will say to do is start cutting, carefully slicing against the grain on the flat side. If you don't think you can remember where that is, you can always cut a flat starter piece so that you remember when it's done where that flat spot is, cutting the corner off. But you want to cut against the grain on the flat first, all the way down until it's obvious that that's where the flat and the point have combined as you're slicing. At that point, you want to rotate it 90 degrees. Now use a good slicing knife. You might have one from Thanksgiving. The first time I cut a brisket, I didn't even have one, so I used a bread knife. It wasn't great, but it actually worked. Buy a slicer. You can get a decent slicer anywhere from like 20 to 50 bucks. You don't have to spend hundreds of dollars. but get a good slicer. I got a longer one because some of these briskets are pretty big. Ideally, you want to cut 1/4 inch thick slices. I'll admit, sometimes I cut them thicker and nobody's complained yet. So you're cutting the flat all the way to where the two muscles combine, then you'll rotate at 90 degrees. At this point, you'll see in a lot of videos that guys will cut the point in half at this point and show you off all the juices flowing, but that's not how I tend to cut it. It's just harder to cut when you have two halves. So once I've rotated at 90 degrees and we're cutting the point, that fatty, moist side of the brisket, I'll just start at one end and start cutting 1/4 inch slices all the way until I'm done. Now, if you look, there's some uneven pieces here, these ends. Cut those off and reserve those for yourself. We'll call those the burnt ends. That's some great stuff. You cut those into chunks and chow them down. When I'm slicing the point, the fattier meat, I don't separate those two muscles. I don't try to cut that fat out. That's gonna keep it from drying out. You're not a restaurant. You're not worried about how it looks. We're eating this thing. It's gonna be awesome. Just as you're cutting it to eat, just cut around the fat on your plate. But don't separate the two, and don't try to cut the fat out as you're presenting it at home. If your neighbors complain, they don't get invited again. Thanks for watching, guys. Please let us know how it works out for you when you cook your first brisket, and subscribe at the button below.